Look at this face. To the public, Yuri Konstantin is the face of global recruitment, a billionaire visionary bringing jobs to the world. But behind the closed doors of his luxury office, he is a predator who doesn't just own businesses, he owns people. Yuri has one rule: everyone has a price, and everyone has a secret. He thought Zala Basira was no different, just another girl fleeing the shadows of Afghanistan, desperate enough to sign away her life for a tech scholarship. He burned her passport. He trapped her in a black site. He thought he broke her. But Yuri made a fatal mistake. He forgot that those who have seen the worst of humanity don't fear death, they fear silence. Right now, as he screams in her face, he has no idea that the phone in her hand isn't just a device. It's a ticking time bomb. It's recording every word of his confession. While he's focused on her wrist, she's already dismantling his billion-dollar empire, bite by bite. This is the moment the hunter became the prey. The dust of Kabul always seemed to carry the scent of spent gunpowder and ancient grief, but for Zala Basira, the morning air suddenly felt like pure oxygen. In her trembling hands, she clutched a heavy, cream-colored envelope that felt out of place against the scarred walls of her family's home. The gold-embossed seal of the Konstantin Global Initiative shimmered under the harsh Afghan sun, a beacon of impossible light in a world of gray. "Mother, look," Zala whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and soaring hope. She had spent years studying by candlelight, mastering languages and coding logic while the world outside fell apart. She wasn't just looking for a job, she was looking for a way to save her family from the cycle of conflict that had claimed so much already. This acceptance letter for a prestigious tech scholarship in London was the golden ticket she had prayed for, a lifeline thrown across an ocean of despair. As she read the elegant script promising a high-paying career and global protection, the survivor's guilt that usually weighed down her heart began to lift. She imagined herself in the gleaming glass towers of a modern city, finally far away from the echoes of gunfire. To Zala, Yuri Konstantin wasn't a name to be feared. He was the faceless benefactor, the visionary billionaire who saw her potential when the rest of the world saw only a refugee. She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 21 years. She could almost see the skyline of London, envisioning a future where her brilliance was a tool for creation, not just survival. Her heart raced with the thrill of a new beginning, unaware that the ink on the page was a contract signed in shadow. In that moment of pure, radiant hope, Zala didn't see the trap. She didn't see the shadow architect watching from a world away, marking her as his next elite pawn. She only saw the light, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was finally flying toward freedom. To the world, Yuri Konstantin was a masterpiece of PR, a man in a $10,000 Brioni suit who spoke of global connectivity and lifting the impoverished. But inside the soundproof glass of his London penthouse, the suit was merely a shroud for a predator. Yuri didn't walk, he prowled, his presence heavy with the cold, metallic scent of old money and fresh blood. At 55, his face was a map of ruthless victories, etched with a stubble beard that couldn't hide the jagged scars of a man who had fought his way out of the Russian underworld to build a digital throne. Zala stood trembling as Yuri approached, the luxury of the office feeling more suffocating than any prison cell. He didn't look at her with lust, but with the clinical detachment of a programmer looking at a line of code. He reached out, his hand mapped with visible veins and tattoos, gripping her wrist with a force that promised a quick snap if she dared to flinch. "You think you are special, Zala," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "In my world, you are a data point. A ghost in my machine." With a flick of his remote, The floor-to-ceiling windows darkened, and the walls came alive with 100 glowing monitors. This was the eye in the sky, Yuri's true god. Thousands of live feeds flickered in a sickening mosaic, men shivering in the cargo holds of ships, women being prepped for heists in Tokyo, and corrupt politicians laughing in rooms they thought were private. Every move was tracked, every heartbeat was logged. Yuri leaned in closer, his rugged face inches from hers, his eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "I see everything," he growled, "and what I see, I own. You didn't come here for a scholarship. You came here to become a shadow." The emotional weight of his words hit Zala harder than a physical blow. She realized then that her documents weren't just lost, they were replaced by a digital leash. The eye wasn't just for surveillance, it was a weapon of total leverage. As Yuri stared into her wide, tear-filled eyes, he saw a broken girl. He didn't see the war survivor who had already lived through the death of empires. He didn't see that while he was showing her his power, she was already looking for the off switch. Yuri believed he controlled everyone, but as the red recording light of her hidden phone flickered out of his sight, the shadow was already starting to fight back. The roar of the jet engines felt like the sound of a new beginning, a thunderous applause for Zala's escape from a life of dust and echoes. As the plane leveled off into the midnight sky, she clutched the acceptance letter from the Konstantin Global Initiative like a holy relic. It promised a tech scholarship, a career in London, and a way to finally quiet the survivor's guilt that had haunted her since Afghanistan. Across the aisle, a flight attendant offered her a small glass of water with a polite, stiff smile. Zala drank it all, her heart racing with hope, unaware that the liquid was the first gear turning in Yuri Konstantin's machine. The transition was not a landing, but a slide into a cold, chemical void. When Zala's eyes finally fluttered open, the pressurized cabin was gone, replaced by the smell of damp concrete and industrial bleach. Her head throbbed with a rhythmic, stabbing pain that synchronized with the flickering of a single, naked fluorescent bulb overhead. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like leaden weights. This wasn't a dormitory, it was a cage. As her vision cleared, the shadow of a man materialized in the corner of the room. It wasn't Yuri, but one of his silent, stone-faced enforcers. Without a word, he dropped a small metal bin onto the floor. Inside, the acrid scent of burning plastic filled the small space. Zala watched in paralyzed horror as the man tossed a small, dark booklet onto the embers. It was her passport. The blue and gold cover curled and blackened, turning her identity into ash in a matter of seconds. "Welcome to the London hub," a cold, synthesized voice crackled through a speaker hidden in the ceiling. It was Yuri. "You were worried about your past, Zala. Now you don't have one. You are no longer a student, a refugee, or a citizen. You are an asset. You will work, you will obey, and if you are very lucky, you will survive." Zala lunged for the door, but the heavy steel didn't even vibrate against her frantic fists. She looked up and saw it, a small, blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling. The eye in the sky. Yuri was watching her fear, feeding on it. In that moment, the golden dream evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization that she hadn't flown toward freedom. She had delivered herself directly into the mouth of a monster. The heavy iron door groaned open, revealing the true face of Yuri Konstantin's empire, a cold, subterranean labyrinth that smelled of ozone and unwashed fear. This was the Black Site, a high-tech dungeon hidden beneath the glitz of London where dreams were ground into dust. Zala was pushed inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the flickering fluorescent lights that hummed like a terminal illness. To her left, a row of men sat on plastic crates, their faces hollow and gray. They were the couriers, modern-day mules forced to swallow plastic-wrapped packages of narcotics destined for the streets of Tokyo and Dubai. One man looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, clutching a stomach filled with a cargo that could kill him if a single seal broke. There was no medical staff here, only armed guards who viewed these men as disposable containers. To her right, the scene shifted into a chillingly sterile contrast. Young women, some no older than Zala, sat before glowing monitors in a cramped, windowless room. These were the tech spies, the elite captives of the Konstantin Global Initiative. Their fingers flew across keyboards, not for innovation, but for destruction. Under the watchful gaze of Yuri's 24/7 surveillance cameras, they were forced to conduct high-stakes heists, draining the offshore accounts of political rivals and planting deepfake evidence to ruin reputations. Zala felt a wave of nausea hit her as she realized the scale of the architect's leverage. Every woman here was a puppet, held by invisible strings of blackmail and threats against their families back home. They weren't just stealing money, they were stealing the stability of nations to keep Yuri on his throne. The weight of her survivor's guilt pressed down on her chest like a physical stone. She saw the faces of those she had left behind in Afghanistan mirrored in the broken spirits around her. For a moment, Zala wanted to scream, to weep for the girl who thought she was coming here for a scholarship. But then, she caught the eye of a girl across the room, a silent, knowing glance that flickered with a spark of recognition. In that instant, Zala's fear began to harden into a cold, sharp resolve. She realized that while Yuri's cameras saw their faces, he couldn't see the code they were beginning to write in their minds. The black site was designed to be their grave, but as Zala took her seat at a terminal, she vowed it would become the birthplace of a revolution. The cold hum of the server room was the only sound that dared to breathe in Yuri Konstantin's presence. Zala stood at the edge of the shadows, her fingers trembling against her sides as she watched the wall of monitors illuminating Yuri's rugged, stubbled face in a ghoulish blue light. This was the heart of his empire, the eye in the sky. Yuri leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of expensive vodka in one hand, the other resting near a control panel that dictated life and death across 3 continents. Control is not about being everywhere at once, Zala, Yuri rasped, his Russian accent thick and heavy like a physical weight in the room. It is about making them believe you are. He pointed a thick, veined finger at the central screen. On the monitor, a grainy CCTV feed showed a man named Eris, an elite courier who had been caught trying to siphon off data to a rival firm. Eris sat in what looked like a luxury hotel room in Dubai, unaware that his every breath was being broadcast to his executioner. Zala felt a wave of nausea. She knew Eris. He had shared a whispered word of encouragement with her only a week ago. Now he was merely a data point on Yuri's grid. Yuri tapped a key, and the camera zoomed in until Eris's sweating pores filled the screen. He thought he found a blind spot, Yuri chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. He forgot that I built the blind spots. With a casual flick of his wrist, Yuri activated a remote link. On the screen, the smart lock on Eris's door clicked shut. The ventilation system hissed. Zala watched in frozen horror as Eris began to cough, clutching his throat as invisible gas flooded the room. He scrambled toward the window, but the reinforced glass was part of the architect's design. He looked directly into the camera, directly at Yuri, pleading with wide, bulging eyes. Yuri didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his drink, his glaring expression reflected in the glass of the monitor. This is the rule, Zala. Disloyalty is a virus. And I am the cure. As Eris collapsed, his life flickering out in a frantic, lonely struggle, Yuri turned his cold gaze toward her. The red rec light on the console blinked like a mocking heartbeat. The message was clear. There was no corner of the world he could not see, and no soul he could not crush. Zala lowered her head, the weight of her survivor's guilt threatening to pull her under. But beneath the dark fabric of her hijab, her eyes weren't just wet with tears. They were beginning to burn with a new, dangerous clarity. If Yuri was the architect of this nightmare, she would have to become the flaw in his foundation. The cold air of the London black site felt like a physical weight as Zala sat before a wall of monitors. This was no longer the tech scholarship she had dreamed of, it was a digital cage. Behind her, the heavy tread of Yuri Konstantin's boots echoed against the concrete floor. He leaned over her, the scent of expensive tobacco and old malice filling her senses as he tapped a folder on her desk. Inside was the digital profile of a high-ranking senator. He thinks his encryption is a fortress. Yuri's voice was a low, gravelly rasp near her ear. Show him that in my world, there are no locked doors. You have 1 hour to bypass his private server or the recruitment fee for your family back in Kabul doubles tonight. Zala's fingers trembled over the mechanical keyboard, but as the screen flickered to life, her survivor's instinct took over. She wasn't just a victim, she was a woman who understood the language of machines. As she began to peel back the senator's security layers, she felt Yuri's gaze, the eye in the sky, watching her every keystroke. He wanted the senator's secrets for blackmail, a currency he used to maintain his stranglehold on power. However, as Zala bypassed the final firewall, she didn't just find the senator's files. A ghosted directory appeared in the corner of the network map, a hidden, ultra-encrypted partition labeled K-Architect Root. It was Yuri's private server. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the brain of the monster. While Yuri stood over her, gloating as the senator's scandalous communications began to download, Zala's peripheral vision stayed locked on that hidden drive. She realized in that moment that Yuri's greatest flaw was his own arrogance. He was so focused on the targets he was hunting that he didn't realize his most dangerous weapon was now inside his own house. Using a fragmented background script she had written in the dark hours of the night, she planted a microscopic digital seed within Yuri's root directory, a silent observer that would feed her his blind spots. Done, she whispered, her voice thick with a fake terror that masked her growing resolve. Yuri let out a cold, triumphant laugh and gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into the bone. Good girl, he sneered. You see? Freedom is earned through service. As he walked away to celebrate his new leverage, Zala stared at the glowing rec icon on her hidden interface. The mission was a success for him, but for her, it was the first crack in his invincible armor. The air in the London black site was thick with the metallic scent of damp concrete and the low, electric hum of Yuri's ever-present cameras. Zala moved through the shadows of the basement, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was heading toward the ventilation shaft where she and Malik, a kind-hearted boy from Kabul who had become her only brother in this hell, exchanged whispered hope. Malik had been assigned a high-risk courier run that evening, a polite way of saying he was forced to swallow packets of high-grade narcotics to bypass airport security. When she found him, he wasn't waiting. He was collapsed against the cold brick, his face a terrifying shade of gray. One of the packets had ruptured. As Zala fell to her knees, pulling his head into her lap, she looked up instinctively at the red eye of the security camera blinking above them. Yuri was watching. She knew he was sitting in his leather chair, watching the life drain out of a 20-year-old boy as if it were nothing more than a glitch in his data stream. Malik, stay with me, she breathed, her voice cracking. Malik's hand gripped her sleeve, his knuckles white, but his eyes were already glazing over. He whispered a final, jagged prayer before his body went limp in her arms. In that devastating silence, Zala's world fractured. The survivor's guilt that had haunted her since Afghanistan threatened to swallow her whole, the crushing weight of another life lost while she remained. But as she stared into the lens of the camera, something shifted. The tears didn't stop, but they went cold. The frantic terror that had defined her since the midnight flight was replaced by a terrifying, surgical clarity. She realized that Yuri didn't see Malik as a human. He saw him as a failed delivery. If she continued to play by Yuri's rules, everyone in this basement would end up in a nameless grave. Zala gently closed Malik's eyes, her hands no longer shaking. She looked directly into the camera, a silent promise burning in her gaze. She would no longer be a pawn in his deadly game. She would become the virus that crashed his entire system. Her grief was no longer a burden, it was the fuel for a revolution. As she stood up and walked back toward the tech terminal, Zala Basira was gone. In her place stood the woman who would dismantle an empire, bite by agonizing bite. Deep within the bowels of the London black site, the air was thick with the hum of cooling fans and the sterile scent of ozone. Zala sat before a wall of monitors, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision born of desperation. To the armed guards patrolling the corridor, she was just another asset processing data for Yuri's global empire. To Yuri, watching through his eye in the sky, she was a broken girl finally submitting to her role in his grand design. They were both wrong. Zala knew that Yuri's obsession with total surveillance was his greatest strength, but it was also the crack in his armor. He monitored the cameras, the phone lines, and the physical movements of his captives, but he didn't truly understand the language of the machine. Hidden within the mundane recruitment logs and shipping manifests was a secondary layer of reality, a ghost network she had begun to weave during the long, lonely hours of the night shift. Using a form of steganography she had learned years ago to bypass sensors in Afghanistan, Zala began embedding messages in the metadata of Yuri's internal files. A slight alteration in a pixel's hex code or a deliberate typo in a client's address became a lifeline. She called it the Whisper Network. "I am Zala. I am in London." "You are not alone," she typed, masking the text within a high-stakes heist report. Seconds later, a ping returned from a server in Dubai. It was a courier named Malik, a man forced to carry packages in his stomach across borders. His response was buried in a shipment invoice. "They took my sister. Tell me what to do." Zala felt the familiar sting of survivor's guilt tightening in her chest, the memory of those she couldn't save back home fueling her resolve. She couldn't let Malik become another shadow. She began transmitting the blind spots she had mapped in the surveillance grid, teaching the others how to communicate without alerting the eye. As more voices joined the digital underground, men from Tokyo, women from New York, the fear that had paralyzed them began to transmute into a cold, collective fury. They were the unseen gears in Yuri's machine, and for the first time, they were learning how to grind that machine to a halt. Yuri Konstantin thought he controlled everyone because he could see them. He didn't realize that in the silence between the frames of his cameras, a revolution was being coded. Zala took a shaky breath, her eyes reflecting the glowing text of a dozen rebels ready to strike. The architect's walls were high, but the foundation was already starting to crumble. The blue light of the monitors cast a ghostly pallor over Zala's face, mirroring the coldness in her heart as she sat deep within the bowels of the London black site. To anyone watching the surveillance feed, she appeared to be just another terrified captive obediently processing data for Yuri Konstantin's empire. But beneath the surface of her trembling hands, Zala was a war survivor from Afghanistan who had learned long ago that every fortress, no matter how high-tech, has a crack in its foundation. Yuri bragged that his eye in the sky saw everything, a digital godhead that recorded every heartbeat of his captives and every sin of his corrupt political clients. He used this data as a stranglehold on power, believing that total surveillance guaranteed total control. However, Zala's brilliant mind, honed by the desperation of her past, began to notice a rhythm in the system. She realized that while Yuri watched the cameras with a predatory focus, he failed to watch the very people he had enslaved to operate them. He viewed them as subhuman pawns, and in his arrogance, he assumed a pawn could never understand the board. Hours bled into a singular, caffeine-fueled blur as Zala navigated the labyrinthine architecture of Yuri's private server. She wasn't just looking for files, she was looking for silence. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing encrypted firewalls that guarded the secrets of the shadow architect. Then, she found it, a recursive loop in the security protocol. It was a digital blind spot, a small corner of the server used for maintenance that Yuri deemed too insignificant to monitor. In this unmonitored space, the air in the cramped room suddenly felt less heavy. This was the crack in the armor. It was here that she could store the evidence of his crimes without the red "REC" icon ever flashing on his master console. She felt a flicker of the survivor's guilt that usually weighed her down begin to transform into a cold, sharp resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was becoming the architect of his destruction. Zala knew the stakes. If she was caught, she would be deleted like a corrupted file to protect Yuri's elite clients. But as she looked at the digital blind spot, she didn't see a risk, she saw a weapon. She began to upload the first fragments of the truth, preparing to turn Yuri's own surveillance empire into the cage that would eventually trap him forever. The air in Yuri's penthouse office was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the cold, metallic tang of filtered oxygen. Zala felt the weight of the smartphone hidden in the palm of her hand, its screen pressed against her thigh, the red recording light pulsing like a silent heartbeat. She knew the risks. Yuri's eye in the sky was designed to catch every twitch, every whisper. But she had found the blind spot, the ego of a man who believed no one would ever dare to look him in the eye. "You look pale, Zala," Yuri's voice rasped, a sound like dry earth shifting. He stepped into her personal space, his rugged face a map of scars and calculated cruelty. He didn't just walk, he loomed, an architect of shadows who had spent 55 years perfecting the art of ownership. Before she could recoil, his hand shot out, his fingers like iron bands as he gripped her wrist, twisting it upward. The pain was immediate, sharp and white-hot, but Zala didn't scream. She couldn't afford to. "Is it the guilt? Or the fear?" he sneered, pulling her inches from his face until she could see the visible veins throbbing in his temple. "You think those men in the black sites matter? You think the world cares about a few ghosts from Afghanistan or Asia?" He laughed, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through her arm. Zala caught her reflection in the darkened glass behind him, a young woman in a dark hijab, tears streaming down her face, appearing every bit the terrified victim he expected. But beneath the tears, her thumb surreptitiously swiped the screen of the phone held low against her side. "They have names, Yuri," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to feed his arrogance. "They have prices." Yuri roared, his grip tightening until her skin turned a sickly white. "I don't just run an agency, I run the infrastructure of the elite. I am the one who decides who lives and who is deleted to keep my clients happy. Your documents are ash, Zala. Your life is a data point on my server. I own your silence." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear, unaware that every word of his confession was being etched into digital memory. He was admitting it all, the trafficking, the blackmail, the state-sponsored murders. "I am the shadow architect," he hissed, his eyes wide with a manic, untouchable pride. "And you're nothing." Yuri finally shoved her away, disgusted by her perceived weakness. Zala stumbled back, tucking the phone into the folds of her clothing as the recording saved. He thought he had just asserted his dominance. He didn't realize he had just signed his own death warrant, bite by bite. The hunter was still smiling, but the prey had already won. The digital clock on Zala's workstation flickered at 3 a.m., the cold blue light reflecting in her eyes like a silent war. For months, she had lived as a ghost within Yuri Konstantin's machine, mapping the veins of an empire built on blackmail and human misery. Now, the Whisper network was ready. Across 3 continents, in the hidden black sites of Tokyo, Dubai, and London, other captives sat at their terminals, their fingers hovering over the enter key. They were the unseen cogs in Yuri's surveillance engine, the very people he thought he had broken into submission. Zala took a shaky breath, the weight of her survivor's guilt fueling her resolve. She couldn't save everyone in Afghanistan, but she would not let these lives be deleted. With a single, encrypted command, she signaled the siege. The digital siege didn't begin with a bang, but with a flood. In an instant, the high-tech vault Yuri used to maintain his stranglehold on power was turned inside out. Terabytes of data, clandestine recordings of corrupt officials, transaction logs of human trafficking, and the brutal reality of the recruitment agencies, black sites, were catapulted into the servers of every major news outlet from the CNN to BBC to Al Jazeera. In the master control room, the eye in the sky began to glitch. Red alerts flashed across Yuri's massive monitors as his private blackmail files appeared on live television broadcasts simultaneously. The hunter's greatest weapon, his data, was now his executioner. Zala watched the progress bars hit 100%, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the digital siege, the moment the shadow architect's walls crumbled under the weight of the truths he had tried to bury. Yuri's empire was no longer a secret fortress. It was a glass house being shattered by the very people he had deemed disposable. As the first headlines began to scroll across the internet, Zala knew there was no going back. The world was finally watching, and for the first time in years, the silence was over. The penthouse was silent, save for the low hum of the servers that served as Yuri Konstantin's digital nervous system. Yuri sat at the head of the mahogany table, the city lights of London sprawling behind him like a conquered map. He looked every bit the billionaire visionary the world believed him to be, his rugged face set in a mask of cold arrogance as he reviewed blackmail data on his tablet. He didn't even look up when Zala entered the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Zala moved with a practiced, ghost-like grace, her dark hijab a shadow against the opulent gold leaf of the dining room. In her hands, she carried a silver tray with a single crystal decanter and a glass. This was the Last Supper, though Yuri believed it was merely a celebration of another successful heist against his political rivals. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to betray her, but her face remained a mask of submissive stone. She was no longer just the desperate girl from Afghanistan. She was the architect of his end. "The 1945 vintage, sir," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Yuri grunted, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Pour it." As the deep crimson liquid swirled into the glass, Zala's mind flashed to the black sites and the men and women Yuri had treated as disposable pawns. The wine was beautiful, but it carried a hidden passenger, a slow-acting, odorless neurotoxin she had spent weeks procuring through her secret network. It was designed not to kill instantly, but to mimic a catastrophic stroke, paralyzing the man who spent his life controlling every movement of others. She watched as his tattooed hand, the same hand that had crushed her wrist in fury, reached for the glass. He took a long, appreciative sip, the toxin beginning its invisible journey into his bloodstream. Zala felt a surge of cold justice. For years, Yuri had used his eye in the sky to record the secrets of the powerful. Now, she stood in his blind spot, watching the man who saw everything miss the very thing that would undo him. "Is there anything else, sir?" she asked, her eyes momentarily catching his reflection in the window. "Leave," he snapped, dismissing her as he would a piece of furniture. Zala bowed her head and backed out of the room. As the heavy doors clicked shut, she checked the time. In 60 minutes, the digital siege would begin. In 90 minutes, Yuri Konstantin would lose the ability to speak. By dawn, the shadow architect would be a prisoner in a cage of his own bone and skin, while the world he terrorized finally woke up to the truth. The hunter had just swallowed the bait. The air in Yuri's luxury office was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the metallic tang of high-end electronics, but for the first time in his life, the shadow architect felt a chill that no climate control could fix. He sat behind his monolithic desk, the monitors surrounding him flickering with the chaotic green and red of his failing empire. He tried to reach for his glass of wine, the last supper Zala had served him with such haunting grace, but his fingers refused to obey. A heavy, leaden numbness was climbing up his arm, settling into his chest like a cold stone. Across the desk, Zala stood perfectly still. She wasn't the terrified girl from the recruitment posters anymore. She was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. She watched with a terrifying, quiet intensity as Yuri's face began to sag, the muscles on his right side losing their lifelong grip of iron. He tried to roar at her, to demand she call his security detail, but all that emerged was a wet, broken gurgle. The neurotoxin was working with surgical precision, mimicking a massive stroke that effectively locked him inside the prison of his own skin. "You always said everyone has a secret, Yuri," Zala whispered, her voice cutting through the hum of the servers. "Mine was that I never intended to survive your world. I only intended to end it." She turned the monitors toward him. On every screen, the eye in the sky was turning against its creator. He watched in helpless horror as his private blackmail archives, the leverage he used to choke world leaders, were uploaded to public servers in a relentless digital tide. The symbols of his power were dissolving into lines of code that now belonged to the world. He saw the red lights of Interpol tactical teams breaching his Tokyo black site on the live feed, his bodyguards being thrown to the ground like the pawns he always claimed they were. Yuri's eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted toward the door, begging for a rescue that would never come. He was the man who controlled everyone, yet he could no longer control his own tongue to plead for mercy. He slumped forward, his cheek hitting the cold mahogany of his desk, forced to watch the silent, flickering broadcast of his ruin. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged, failing breath and the distant, approaching sirens of justice. Zala walked to the door, leaving him in the darkness of his own making, a king with no kingdom, a master with no voice, rotting in the center of a burning empire. The digital floodgates had been thrown open, and for the first time in his reign, Yuri Konstantin's eye in the sky was looking at its own demise. Across the globe, from the neon-soaked alleys of Tokyo to the sterile luxury of London, the signal Zala had spent months perfecting finally pulsated through the airwaves. It was a symphony of justice, and it was the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement. Outside the London headquarters, the silence of the night was shattered by the rhythmic thrum of low-flying helicopters. Tactical teams from Interpol, working in perfect synchronization with local SWAT units, descended upon the black sites that had served as Yuri's invisible torture chambers. There was no more need for stealth. The data Zala leaked had already mapped every guard's position and every biometric lock's bypass code. Flashbangs erupted with blinding intensity, white light washing out the surveillance monitors that Yuri had once used to watch his captives like insects in a jar. The reinforced steel doors, which had stood as symbols of absolute despair for so many, were breached with surgical precision. Through the smoke and the chaos, the commands of the officers cut through the air, not with the cruelty of the Mafia, but with the cold efficiency of the law. In the underground sectors, the pawns looked up, their faces illuminated by the tactical lights of the rescue teams. Men who had been coerced into carrying death in their veins and women who had been forced into the shadows of corporate espionage finally saw the one thing Yuri had tried to erase: a way out. They weren't being treated as criminals, they were being shielded as witnesses. As the shadow architect lay paralyzed in his office, his vision blurring from the toxin, he could hear the heavy thud of the breach team outside his double mahogany doors. He watched, helpless, as the red rec icon on the scattered monitors flickered out, replaced by the blue and white seals of Interpol. The very system he built to blackmail the world was now a digital prison cell. Zala stood at the edge of the perimeter, wrapped in a thermal blanket provided by a female officer. She watched as her whisper network emerged from the darkness of the building, blinking against the harsh floodlights of the police perimeter. They were no longer nameless data points or expendable couriers. They were survivors walking into the light. For Zala, the weight of her survivor's guilt didn't vanish, but it transformed. She hadn't just survived the fire this time, she had used it to forge a key for everyone else. The siege was over. The era of the architect was dead. The fluorescent lights of the high-security medical wing hummed with a sterile, relentless persistence, a far cry from the opulent, amber-lit shadows of Yuri Konstantin's former empire. Inside cell 402, the man who once moved world leaders like chess pieces lay perfectly still. The neurotoxin Zala had expertly delivered had done its work with poetic precision. Yuri was alive, but he was a prisoner within the very flesh he had once used to intimidate the vulnerable. He was a ghost in a machine of tubes and monitors, his eyes the only part of him that still betrayed the fury of a fallen god. Across the small, mounted television screen, the image of Zala Basira flickered into view. She wasn't the terrified girl from the recruitment office or the weeping captive in the hijab whose wrist he had nearly snapped. She stood at a sun-drenched podium, the emblem of the United Nations gleaming behind her. Her voice, once a whisper in the dark, now commanded the attention of the globe as she announced the official formation of the Freedom of Peace Ambassadors. Every word she spoke was a hammer blow to his legacy, dismantling the secrets he had spent a lifetime gathering. Yuri tried to scream, to curse her name, to command his guards to silence her, but his throat remained a frozen cavern. He was forced to watch as the pawns he had exploited, the men he sent into the mouths of danger, and the women he treated as disposable tools, stepped into the light to receive immunity and protection. The eye in the sky had been turned around. The world was now watching him, not with fear, but with a cold, clinical indifference. He was no longer the shadow architect. He was a medical curiosity, a man sentenced to a life of total silence in a world that had moved on without him. As the broadcast ended, Zala looked directly into the camera, and for a fleeting second, Yuri felt as though she was looking directly into his soul. The screen went black, leaving him in the oppressive quiet of his ward. The empire was gone. The leverage was dead. In the end, the woman he thought he could control had left him with the one thing he feared most, the haunting echo of his own crimes, replaying in the silence of his mind forever. Zala Basira proved that no matter how much power a man thinks he has, he can never truly own a person's spirit. Yuri Konstantin built a world of walls and cameras, but he forgot that walls can be climbed and cameras can be turned around. Today, Zala and the survivors are the freedom ambassadors, ensuring that no more dreams are turned into debts. If this story reminded you that the smallest spark can burn down the darkest empire, then let us know in the comments. I am the architect of my own life. Don't let stories like this stay in the shadows. Subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications so you never miss a tale of justice served. Like and share this video to stand with the survivors globally. Remember, your voice is your greatest weapon. Use it.